The room was very quiet when my husband looked at me and said, "Your Honor, my wife has been lying to this court." I remember the way the fluorescent lights hummed above us. I remember the grain of the wooden railing under my fingertips, and I remember thinking, not panic, not rage, just this flat, exhausted thought. After 23 years, this is where we've ended up. My name is Vivian. I'm 51 years old. I spent 18 years in the Canadian Armed Forces, medically released at 44, after my body started doing things I couldn't explain, and doctors spent 2 years telling me I was imagining. I married my husband, Stewart, when I was 28, back when we were both young enough to believe that love was enough to carry everything else. It wasn't. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Stewart and I met at a wedding in Kelowna. He was the groom's cousin from Winnipeg, tall and quiet in the way I mistook for depth back then. I was on leave, still in youth-form metaphorically, if not literally, still carrying myself the way the forces had taught me, straight back, eyes forward, no unnecessary words. He said he liked that about me. Said he'd never met a woman who didn't fill silence with noise. We dated long distance for 1.5 years. When I got posted to Petawawa, he followed. Not for me, he was clear about that. He had a job opportunity. It was convenient, but he followed, and at the time I told myself it meant something. We bought a house on Boundary Road in 2006. 3 bedrooms, a finished basement, a backyard with a birch tree that dropped leaves for what felt like 4 solid months every fall. I loved that house. I still do even now. His mother, Lorraine, lived 40 minutes away in Pembroke. She was one of those women who had never quite finished raising her son and didn't intend to stop now that he was 42. She called 3 times a week. She had a key to our house. Stewart had given it to her before I moved in, and when I asked him to get it back, he told me I was being territorial. "She's my mother," he said. "She doesn't need to knock." I let it go. I let a lot of things go in those early years because I was gone so often, and when you're away 6 months out of 12, you pick your battles carefully. The health problem started in 2018. I was 44, still serving, and I began having episodes where my legs would simply stop cooperating. Not pain exactly. More like a sudden disconnection, like the signal between my brain and my body got dropped mid-sentence. I'd be standing at the kitchen counter and my knees would buckle, or I'd be walking across the parade square and I'd have to grab someone's arm. The first doctor I saw said it was stress. The second said it was perimenopause. The third sent me for an MRI, and then told me, with very little eye contact, that the results were within normal parameters and that I might want to consider counseling. I was a logistics officer. I had coordinated supply chains in Afghanistan. I had managed inventories worth millions of dollars, under conditions that would have made most people curl into a ball. And 3 separate doctors told me, in 3 separate ways, that what was happening to my body was probably in my head. Stewart, to his credit, took me to those first few appointments, but somewhere around the 4th or 5th, he stopped coming in with me. He'd drop me at the entrance, park the car, and wait with his phone. When I'd come out, he wouldn't ask what the doctor said. He'd ask if I was hungry. I was medically released in late 2019. The paperwork cited musculoskeletal limitations, which was true as far as it went, but it left out all the parts that weren't easily categorized. Veterans Affairs Canada opened a file. The process was slow, as it always is, and required documentation that I was sometimes too exhausted to gather, and phone calls I sometimes didn't have the capacity to make. Stewart started calling it the disability thing. Not my condition. Not my health, the disability thing. "Did you hear back about the disability thing?" He'd ask, not looking up from his laptop. I learned to answer in one word. Lorraine had her own theory. She shared it with me one afternoon in March of 2020, standing in my kitchen uninvited, holding a mug of tea she'd made herself from my cupboards. "I think," she said carefully, "that Stewart needs a partner who can really be there for him. Emotionally, physically, you know what I mean." I looked at her for a long moment. "Are you suggesting that your son would be better off without me?" She set her mug down. "I'm saying that this has been very hard on him." I didn't cry. I was past crying by then. I thanked her for her concern and I asked her to let herself out. That evening, I told Stewart what his mother had said. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "She's not wrong that this has been hard on me." That was the sentence. Not the one in the courtroom, not the forgery, not any of it. That was the sentence that told me everything I needed to know about where my husband had put me in the ordering of his world. But I still didn't leave. Not yet. I have a friend. Her name is June. We met during my second year in the forces, when we were both junior officers doing a logistics course at CFB Borden. She's the kind of person who says exactly what she means, and means exactly what she says, which in the military made her either your greatest asset or your worst enemy, depending on the situation. For me, she was the closest thing I had to a sister. June had left the military earlier than I did and gone into medicine. She was working as an internist at a hospital in Ottawa by the time my health started deteriorating. We'd stayed in touch through the years the way military friendships work, long silences and then calls that lasted 3 hours, picking up exactly where we'd left off. In January of 2021, June drove out to Petawawa to see me. She sat across from me at my kitchen table and watched me try to open a jar of pasta sauce and drop it twice before I got it open, and she didn't say anything polite or reassuring. She just said, "Vivian, this isn't in your head." She referred me to a neurologist in Ottawa she trusted. It took 6 months to get the appointment. During those 6 months, Stewart began spending weekends in Winnipeg. He said he needed to check on his mother. He said it was hard to be in the house when I was like this. I didn't ask what like this meant. I was afraid he'd tell me. The neurologist, a quiet man named Dr. Yoon who wore the same color of tie every appointment, ordered a full workup. Blood panels, nerve conduction studies, a second MRI with contrast. He called me in October to tell me he had something to discuss. I sat in a chair across from his desk and he explained, carefully and without rushing, that I had an autoimmune condition affecting my peripheral nervous system. It was manageable. It was not imaginary. There was a treatment protocol that had shown good results in patients with similar presentations. I sat in my car in the parking garage on Carling Avenue for 45 minutes before I could drive, not because I was frightened, though I was, but because I had spent 3 years being told there was nothing wrong with me, and the relief of being believed was almost more than I could process at once. I called Stewart first, which I shouldn't have. He was quiet and then he said, "Okay, well, at least now we know." I called June second, she cried. I didn't then, that came later. In the bath that night, with the water going cold around me and my dog, a gray shepherd mix named Constance, pawing at the door until I let her in, and she sat with me on the bath mat until I was done. I started treatment in November. It helped, slowly, unevenly, the way these things do. I had months that were better and months that were worse. I learned to track my symptoms, to plan my days around my energy, to ask for help without hating myself for it. What I didn't do was notice that my husband had been rearranging our finances. In fairness to myself, I was occupied. VAC was processing my disability pension, which involved a quantity of paperwork that seemed calibrated to make veterans give up and go away. I was managing my medical appointments, my medications, my gradually improving function. I was doing the work of rebuilding a life around a body I was still learning to understand. Stewart handled the bills. He always had. It was one of the first divisions of labor we'd settled into. I managed the logistics. He managed the money. I trusted him with that the way I'd trusted him with the house key, the way I'd trusted him with telling Lorraine her limits, which is to say, more than I should have. The first thing I noticed was a letter from our bank that came when Stewart was in Winnipeg again. It was regarding a joint line of credit I hadn't known we had. The limit was $30,000. The balance was $27,000. I called the bank, and the person I spoke with was apologetic but firm. Both signatures were on file. Both parties were liable. My signature, which I had not provided. I didn't call Stewart. I called a lawyer instead. Her name was Ms. Delacroix, and she had an office on Pembroke Street, and the kind of patient, precise manner that made me feel, for the first time in a long time, that I was being taken seriously. She told me to gather every financial document I could access. She told me not to move money, not to confront Stewart, and not to tell his mother anything. She told me to open a new account at a different bank, in my name only, and have my VAC payments directed there. I did all of those things in the order she gave them. The line of credit turned out to be one of 4 accounts Stewart had opened using my information. There was also a credit card with a $9,000 balance, a second mortgage inquiry that had been declined, and a withdrawal of $14,000 from our joint savings that he'd reclassified in his own records as household expenses. Ms. Delacroix filed for divorce on my behalf in April of 2022. Stewart did not take it quietly. The hearing was in November. By then, Stewart had switched lawyers twice, and his current one, a man from Ottawa who wore suits that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month, had built a case around the argument that my disability pension was marital property, that my deteriorating health had made me incapable of managing my own affairs, and that the financial decisions Stewart had made were reasonable responses to the chaos of living with someone in my condition. That last part was his lawyer's word. Chaos. Lorraine had filed an affidavit. In it, she described coming to our home and finding me confused and unable to care for myself. She described Stewart as devoted and patient. She described in 2 careful paragraphs an incident where I had allegedly forgotten to pay a utility bill and the power had been briefly interrupted. The power had not been interrupted. I had a drawer full of paid utility bills and an online account showing continuous service since 2006. But affidavits don't require proof. They require signatures, and Lorraine had signed with a steady hand. I sat at the table on my side of the room and I looked at the papers in front of me, and I thought about all the appointments I'd attended alone, all the parking garages I'd sat in, all the phone calls I'd made from empty rooms, and I breathed the way they'd taught us in the forces. Slowly, from the belly, counting without counting. Stewart's lawyer stood up and said that I had fabricated my medical history to gain financial advantage. He said that I had exaggerated my condition to avoid contributing to the household. He said that the disability pension I was receiving was based on documentation that the court should scrutinize carefully. Stewart did not look at me when his lawyer said these things. He looked at the table in front of him. Then his lawyer said, "Furthermore, Your Honor, my client believes his wife has been deliberately deceiving this court about the nature and severity of her condition." And Stewart looked up, and he looked at me, and he said quietly but clearly enough to carry across the room, "She's been lying." Not his lawyer, him, looking at me, saying those words. I opened my mouth to respond. The room tilted. Not the room, me. My legs, which had been doing well for months, which I had been so careful with, which I had believed, after all this work, I had reached some kind of truce with. My legs stopped. I grabbed the edge of the table. My lawyer, Ms. Delacroix, was halfway out of her chair. The court clerk stood up. Someone in the gallery made a sound. And then there was a voice from behind me, clear and unhurried, the kind of voice that has given directives in loud places and knows how to cut through. And it said, "Your Honor, I'm Dr. June Cahill. I'm an internist and I have this woman's complete medical history. She needs to sit down, and then, with your permission, I need to speak." I didn't fall. I want to be clear about that. My legs went, but I caught the table, and Ms. Delacroix caught my arm, and I sat down in my chair with some portion of dignity intact. But the room had changed. I could feel it change the way weather changes. Not a sound but a pressure shift, something in the air different from what it had been 30 seconds before. The judge, a woman who had been watching the proceedings with an expression of careful neutrality, looked at June standing at the back of the gallery. "Dr. Cahill," she said, "come forward." I had not asked June to come. She had reviewed my file on her own initiative after I'd told her, in a phone call 2 weeks earlier, what Stewart's lawyer was planning to argue. She had applied to be added as an expert witness and been approved. She hadn't told me because she said, and I believe her, that she didn't want me counting on it until it was certain. She stood at the front of that courtroom, and she spoke for 11 minutes. She described my diagnosis in plain language. She explained the nature of autoimmune conditions affecting the peripheral nervous system, how they present, how they're documented, and why they are frequently dismissed by non-specialists. She referenced the nerve conduction studies, the MRI results, the treatment record showing improvement consistent with the protocol Dr. Ewan had prescribed. Then she said, in a tone so even it was almost quiet, "Mrs. Vivian Holt has one of the most thoroughly documented cases in my clinical experience. This is not a woman who has exaggerated her condition. This is a woman who spent 3 years being told her condition didn't exist." The room was still. Lorraine in the gallery had stopped looking at her son. Stewart's lawyer asked to take a brief recess. The judge denied it. She looked at the papers in front of her, and then she looked at Stewart's side of the room for a long moment, and then she said, in that careful official voice that courts use when something has been decided, "I've seen enough of the financial documentation in this case to have substantial concerns about the respondent's conduct regarding joint accounts. We'll be addressing this in full." She looked at Stewart directly when she said it. He did not look back. The process after that took another 4 months. That's how these things work in Canada. Nothing is fast, everything is documented, and justice, when it comes in measured increments. The court found that Stewart had used my personal information to open accounts without my consent. The judge referred the matter to the appropriate authorities, which meant that what had happened to me had a name now, a legal name, and it was being treated accordingly. Ms. Delacroix told me the consequences would be real, that this wasn't the kind of thing that got quietly set aside. I got the house. That was the part I hadn't been sure about. Not the money, not even the pension, but the house on Boundary Road with the birch tree and the finished basement and the back step where I sat sometimes in the evenings, with Constance pressing her weight against my shins. Lorraine did not contact me after the hearing. I did not contact her. Some distances, once they reach a certain point, are the right ones. Stewart moved back to Winnipeg. I heard, through a mutual acquaintance from the forces, that he was living with his mother. I heard it without feeling much of anything, which surprised me at first, and then didn't. June came for the weekend in March, when the hearing was finally, formally closed. She brought a bottle of Ontario Pinot Noir and a container of soup she'd made at home and packed in her bag, which is exactly the kind of person June is. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Lorraine had held her mug, and told me my husband needed a more capable wife. And we ate soup and drank wine, and she told me about a difficult case she was working through, and I told her about the physiotherapy exercises I'd been given, and the small, measurable ways my body was continuing to improve. At some point she looked at me across the table and said, "You know the worst part of your story?" "Which part?" "That you had to get a diagnosis for anyone to believe you." I thought about that for a while, about the fluorescent lights in the courtroom, about Stewart not looking at me while his lawyer said those things. About the 3 doctors who'd used the word psychological as if it were a verdict. "I know," I said, "and you still fought." I looked out the window at the birch tree, which was bare still, the way it always is in March, just branches against the gray sky, waiting. "I didn't know what else to do," I said. "That's the most honest answer I have. I didn't fight because I was brave or strategic or even particularly hopeful. I fought because I'd spent 18 years being trained to hold the line when things got difficult, to document everything, to trust the facts, even when the facts were inconvenient for everyone around me. And because June showed up, and because Ms. Delacroix was thorough, and because Dr. Yoon had ordered the right tests and written down what he found, and because somewhere in the middle of all of it, I had learned, slowly, imperfectly, in the parking garages and the bath with the cold water in the early mornings when my legs wouldn't cooperate, that advocating for yourself is not vanity. It's not drama. It's not the thing people called it when they wanted me to be quieter about my own life. It's just what you do when the alternative is disappearing. Constance is asleep under my chair as I write this. The birch tree has started finally to bud. My legs are not perfect, but they're mine, and I know them better now than I ever did when they were working without complaint. The house is quiet in the way I used to mistake for loneliness. I've learned the difference.